A submarine captain, cut off from the world, seconds away from launching a nuclear torpedo. A wall built overnight to trap millions inside their own city. A president who inherited the deadliest weapon on Earth before he'd even unpacked his desk. This is the story of the Cold War, a conflict where not a single shot was fired between its two main powers, and yet humanity came closer to annihilation than most people ever realize. So how did two allies who defeated Adolf Hitler together end up pointing enough nuclear warheads at each other to destroy the planet several times over? Let's rewind to the moment it all began. When Germany surrendered in 1945, the celebrations were enormous. Crowds packed the streets of London, New York and Moscow, and for a brief moment it genuinely seemed like the world might finally get to rest. But that unity was more fragile than it looked. The United States and the Soviet Union hadn't become allies because they liked each other. They'd teamed up because they shared a common enemy. And once that enemy was gone, so was the glue holding the partnership together. On one side stood the United States, wealthy, largely untouched by bombing campaigns on its own soil, and now in possession of the single most terrifying weapon ever built. On the other stood the Soviet Union, exhausted, suspicious, and haunted by staggering losses. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens had died in the war. When a nation absorbs that kind of trauma, it changes how its leaders view the rest of the world. Safety, to Stalin, meant never being caught off guard again. But the tension wasn't only about fear. It was about two fundamentally incompatible visions of how a society should work. America stood for capitalism, elections, and individual freedom. The Soviet Union stood for state control, collective ownership, and a single ruling party that had little patience for dissent. Each side was convinced the other wanted to erase its way of life, and when two global superpowers both believe they're fighting for survival, the odds of peaceful coexistence start to shrink fast. To understand just how combustible this rivalry became, you have to look at the men steering each country. Joseph Stalin ruled through fear, purging his own military, sending millions to labor camps, trusting almost no one, including his closest allies. In his mind, the West was always plotting the Soviet Union's downfall, and if defending the motherland meant installing loyal governments across Eastern Europe by force, so be it. Meanwhile, in Washington, Harry Truman had just become president after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death, and almost immediately someone informed him that the United States had secretly built the most destructive weapon in human history. Imagine stepping into the most powerful job on Earth and being handed that briefing before you've even found the bathroom. Truman now faced an impossible choice, whether to use the atomic bomb against Japan and what, if anything, to tell Stalin, still technically an ally. He decided to mention it vaguely at a summit meeting. What Truman didn't know was that Stalin already knew everything, thanks to spies who had been quietly funneling nuclear secrets to Moscow for years. Stalin simply nodded and told his own scientists to catch up. Truman, for his part, wasn't a man who backed down easily. He was blunt and deeply distrustful of Soviet intentions from the start. And it was a British voice, not an American one, who gave the growing divide its name. Winston Churchill, speaking at a small college in Missouri, delivered a phrase that would define the next half-century. An iron curtain had descended across Europe, splitting the continent in two. It was the perfect metaphor, and it wasn't going anywhere. Here's the situation Europe found itself in after 1945. The eastern half of the continent was devastated, and there was a massive power vacuum. The Soviet Red Army was already sitting there. So one by one, communist governments rose in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, and these weren't exactly free and fair elections. Soviet troops loomed in the background, secret police silenced opposition, and anyone who pushed back had a way of simply disappearing. Washington's answer was a strategy called containment. The US wouldn't try to reverse what the Soviets had already grabbed, but it would draw a hard line against communism spreading any further. And the epicenter of this standoff was Germany itself, divided into occupation zones after the war: American, British, and French territory in the west, Soviet territory in the east. The real flashpoint, though, was Berlin. The former Nazi capital sat deep inside the Soviet zone, but it too was carved into sectors that left West Berlin as a tiny democratic pocket completely surrounded by communist territory, and Stalin despised it. In 1948, he ordered every road, rail line and canal into West Berlin sealed off, cutting roughly 2 million people off from food, fuel and medicine in one move. His logic was simple. Either the Western powers would abandon the city, or they'd try to force their way through, giving him a pretext to strike. Instead, the West found a third option Stalin never anticipated. American and British aircraft began flying non-stop missions into West Berlin, delivering coal, food, medicine, even chocolate for the city's children. The Berlin airlift wasn't just a logistical marvel, it was a public relations triumph, because it's hard to play the villain when your rival is dropping candy from the sky. Eventually, Stalin backed down and lifted the blockade, having gained absolutely nothing. The West had won its first major Cold War confrontation without firing a single bullet. Not long after, the balance of power shifted overnight when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, years ahead of what American intelligence had predicted, largely because of stolen research. Suddenly, the US no longer held a monopoly on doomsday, and both nations began pouring staggering sums into weapons development. By the early 1950s, hydrogen bombs, devices roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan, had entered the picture. By the 1960s, combined stockpiles were large enough to destroy human civilization many times over. Out of this madness came a doctrine with an almost too perfect acronym, MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction. The idea was brutally simple. If either side launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate, guaranteeing both nations ended up in ruins. No winners ever. And strangely enough, this insane logic worked. When pressing a button guarantees your own destruction, you think twice before touching it. Around this same period, China fell to communism after Mao Zedong's forces won a bloody civil war, and suddenly the most populous country on the planet had joined the Soviet camp. This triggered a wave of anxiety in Washington known as the domino theory, the fear that if one nation turned communist, its neighbors would topple one after another. That theory was tested almost immediately when North Korean troops, backed by Stalin, crossed into South Korea in 1950. The United States led a UN coalition into a brutal 3-year war. American forces initially pushed deep into North Korea, right up to the Chinese border, a move that provoked China into sending hundreds of thousands of its own soldiers across the line, triggering one of the worst retreats in US military history. When General Douglas MacArthur publicly pushed for nuclear weapons, Truman refused and ultimately fired him for insubordination. The war eventually ground to a stalemate at almost the exact border where it started, but not before roughly 36,000 Americans and over 2 million Koreans had died. The Cold War, it turned out, could absolutely become a shooting war. It just hadn't gone nuclear yet. Everything shifted again when Stalin died in 1953 after nearly 3 decades of iron rule. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, seemed almost approachable by comparison, a blunt, colorful former peasant who publicly denounced Stalin's crimes and talked about peaceful coexistence with the West. But don't mistake the folksy charm for softness. When Hungary attempted to break away from Soviet control in 1956, Khrushchev crushed the uprising with tanks, killing roughly 2,000 Hungarians and sending an unmistakable message: Moscow would use whatever force it took to keep its empire together. Then, in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, humanity's first artificial satellite. On its own, it did almost nothing except beep as it orbited the Earth. But the implications terrified America. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead on a rocket aimed at any American city. The so-called space race was really a missile race wearing a lab coat, and the Soviets kept racking up firsts: first animal in orbit, first human in space, first spacewalk. Determined to reclaim the narrative, President John F. Kennedy set an audacious goal: landing an American on the moon before the decade ended. It sounded almost absurd to promise something so ambitious on live television, but he meant it. Not long after, the Cold War produced one of its most visible symbols of division. In August 1961, East German authorities erected the Berlin Wall almost overnight, a concrete barrier lined with guard towers, searchlights, and orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. In truth, it was an admission of failure. Rather than making communism more appealing, Khrushchev simply sealed people inside. At least 140 people would die trying to escape over it in the decades that followed. Kennedy later stood at the wall and delivered one of the era's most memorable lines, declaring solidarity with the divided city and famously proclaiming himself, in essence, a citizen of Berlin. But before that speech, Kennedy had already faced something far more terrifying. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida sat Cuba, where Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution had created the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. After a failed CIA-backed invasion attempt, Castro turned to Moscow for protection, and Khrushchev saw an opportunity. He began secretly installing nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, close enough to strike Washington in roughly 13 minutes. When American reconnaissance planes discovered the missile sites, Kennedy imposed a naval blockade and addressed the nation live on television. For the first time, ordinary Americans understood just how close the world stood to nuclear war. As Soviet ships approached the blockade line, U.S. forces moved to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level in American history. Kennedy ordered nuclear-armed bombers into constant patrol along Soviet strike routes, an unmistakable warning to Moscow. Then came the single most dangerous day of the entire Cold War. On October 27, 1962, American destroyers detected a Soviet submarine near the blockade line and began dropping small depth charges intended as warning signals, urging the sub to surface. But the submarine's crew had been cut off from Moscow for days. They had no idea whether war had already broken out, and conditions on board had become almost unbearable, with temperatures soaring past 100 degrees after the air conditioning failed. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo, one that legally required the agreement of 3 senior officers to fire. The captain wanted to launch. The political officer agreed. That left one man standing between a localized skirmish and a full-scale nuclear war, an officer named Vasily Arkhipov. He refused. Arguing that they had no confirmation a war had actually started, he insisted they surface and make contact with Moscow before doing anything irreversible. Accounts suggest the confrontation nearly turned physical, but without unanimous approval, the torpedo could not be launched. The submarine surfaced. There was no war. That same day, back on the surface, Kennedy and Khrushchev finally reached a resolution. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and in exchange, the US would pledge not to invade the island and would quietly remove its own missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over, and remarkably, no one had pressed the button. Neither side wanted to come that close again, and soon after, a direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings from spiraling out of control. Real peace, though, remained out of reach. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Khrushchev was removed by his own party the following year. And then came Vietnam, the longest, bloodiest, and most divisive proxy conflict of the entire Cold War. American strategy, built to fight Soviet tanks across European plains, struggled against an enemy that could vanish into dense jungle terrain. By the war's end, more than 58,000 Americans and roughly 2 million Vietnamese had lost their lives. Out of that trauma came a period known as détente, a French term essentially meaning relaxation of tension. Under President Richard Nixon, in one of history's more unexpected turns, the US opened diplomatic relations with Communist China, signed arms control agreements with Moscow, and even coordinated a joint American-Soviet spacecraft docking in orbit. For a few years, it genuinely looked like the Cold War might be cooling. It wasn't. In 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, expecting a quick stabilization campaign. Instead, they walked straight into their own brutal, grinding guerrilla war against Afghan fighters armed with American-supplied weapons. Détente was effectively dead. When Ronald Reagan took office, he abandoned any pretense of soft diplomacy, publicly labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire and dramatically ramping up American defense spending. New missiles were deployed across Europe, and Reagan unveiled a proposed space-based missile defense system so ambitious that many experts doubted it could even work. The Soviets, however, couldn't afford to assume it wouldn't, and the arms race roared back to life. But this time, the Soviet system itself was crumbling. A stagnant economy, a losing war in Afghanistan, and 3 Soviet leaders dying in rapid succession within a few years left the country adrift, until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Young and reform-minded, Gorbachev introduced policies aimed at greater openness and economic restructuring, hoping to save the Soviet system. Instead, those very reforms helped unravel it entirely. Despite representing opposing ideologies, Gorbachev and Reagan developed a surprisingly genuine rapport, and in 1987 they signed a landmark treaty in which both superpowers agreed, for the first time, to actually reduce their nuclear arsenals rather than simply slow their growth. Reagan pushed further still, standing at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate and delivering perhaps the era's most quoted challenge, urging Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And piece by piece, that's essentially what happened. Eastern Europe's communist governments began collapsing in rapid succession. Poland held elections and its Communist Party lost decisively. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating an escape route westward. Czechoslovakia underwent its peaceful Velvet Revolution. Country after country broke free, and this time, unlike in 1956, Gorbachev didn't send in tanks to hold the empire together. He simply let it go. That shift eventually reached Berlin itself. When East Germany announced its citizens could cross freely into the West, Thousands rushed the checkpoints, climbing onto the wall itself, celebrating with strangers on the other side. Within months, Germany reunified. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. Soviet republics declared independence one after another, and Gorbachev resigned as the Soviet flag came down for the final time. Against every terrifying possibility, the Cold War ended not with a nuclear apocalypse, but with a wall being dismantled by the very people it had once imprisoned. For 45 years, two superpowers stared each other down, armed with enough weaponry to erase civilization many times over, and somehow, whether through diplomacy, luck, or one submarine officer's refusal to fire, the button was never pushed. It's a strange kind of miracle when you think about it. An entire generation grew up under the shadow of instant annihilation, and the world made it through anyway. But as history has shown time and again, never is a very long word, and the closer you look at how close we actually came, the more that miracle starts to feel less like inevitability and more like a warning worth remembering. Think about how many separate moments could have gone the other way. A tired, overheated crew in a broken submarine, one signature short of launching a torpedo that might have triggered global war. A blockade around a single city that could have turned into open combat between the two most heavily armed nations on Earth. A retreating army at the Chinese border that nearly convinced a general to ask for nuclear weapons on the spot. Each of these moments had an off-ramp, and each time someone, sometimes just one person, chose to take it. That's really what makes the Cold War different from most wars we study. It wasn't decided on a single battlefield or settled with one decisive victory. It was decided in thousands of quiet decisions made by people who will never be household names. Submarine officers, radar technicians, translators relaying messages between capitals, diplomats negotiating through the night. The soldiers who never had to fight, the missiles that were never launched, the treaties signed instead of the trenches dug. These are the parts of the story that rarely make it into the history books, yet they're the reason any of us are here to tell it. And the ripple effects of those 4.5 decades are still shaping the world today. The borders drawn during those years, the alliances formed out of fear, the nuclear stockpiles built in the name of deterrence, all of it is still with us in one form or another. Germany may be reunified, and the wall may now exist mostly in museum fragments and tourist souvenirs, but the instinct behind it, the idea that ideology is worth building a wall over, never fully disappeared from global politics. So the next time someone tells you the Cold War is ancient history, remember this: it ended less than a lifetime ago. The people who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, who watched the Berlin Wall go up and come down, who grew up practicing duck and cover drills in elementary school, are still very much alive. The tension, the fear, the sheer improbability that it all ended peacefully, that's not some distant chapter in a textbook. It's recent enough to touch, and close enough that it's worth asking what we actually learnt from it. Because if there's one lesson buried in all of this, it might be the simplest one. Even when two sides are absolutely convinced the other is the enemy, catastrophe isn't guaranteed. It's a choice, made and remade, sometimes in the span of a few terrifying minutes deep underwater. And for 45 years straight, enough people chose not to press the button. Oh.